Okay, good evening and welcome to Ag in the Evening. My name is Vanessa Corriher-Olson. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist with Texas A&M Arrowleaf Extension. Welcome to our Ag in the Evening program that is sponsored by Gregg County as well as Houston County. Like I said, my name is Vanessa Corriher-Olson. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist with Texas A&M Arrowleaf Extension. I'm officed in Overton. My other colleague, Dr. Jason Banta, who's the beef cattle specialist, also stationed at Overton, is one of our typical hosts as well. So welcome this evening. Our topic tonight is winter pasture options. So I'm going to focus on our different forage options for winter and spring forage here in Central Texas and even parts of or East Texas and even parts of Central Texas. So we're going to go ahead and get started. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature. It's typically best for bandwidth purposes to keep video off for this, as well as to keep from being distracting to other participants. We do record these and we post them on a YouTube channel. If you're not familiar with, we're happy to share that link with you so you can view this as well as other previous events and future events. So we're going to go ahead and get started talking about our winter pasture options. So as far as forage species adaptation, it's highly dependent on location within the state, primarily because of different differentiations in soil types, as well as rainfall. So obviously, as we move east, west, we tend to get more droughty, lower chances or lower average annual rainfall, for normal weather distribution. So rainfall as well as soil types greatly influence our potential success with winter forages. And as we talk about our different species options, we'll talk about how, soil types or weather patterns can influence their success or failure. And so understanding your location within the state, the soil types, drainage of your locations can help you make better selections as far as species and variety selections for your property. And that's not only true for winter forages, but that's also going to be true for any forage species that you are interested in or would like to establish on your property, as a lot of our forages can be very site specific. So we're going to start with talking about our grasses. So when we talk about winter forages, winter and spring forages, we have grasses and we have broadleafs or legumes as options. And we're going to talk about the grasses first. The first grass we're going to talk about is annual ryegrass. So annual ryegrass, as far as our winter forage options, we have the greatest number of acres that are planted in annual ryegrass east of I-35. Production is highly dependent on rainfall. It is well adapted to a variety of soil types. It's very easy to establish, so it's the most commonly used winter forage species that we're going to talk about today because it is easy to establish. It is also, as far as if you are very risk adverse, it is probably the least risky of our winter forage options. And so given our drought conditions across the state, even currently, and higher temperatures, most recently, a lot of people have been concerned and questioned as to whether to even plant winter forages. And so if you were going to take a risk, annual ryegrass is the most forgiving as far as that risk potentially. So this is one of my top recommendations of our grasses. It's the most productive. So that's also an added benefit for annual ryegrass. So a few things to understand about annual ryegrass is that it has bimodal production. So that means its growth pattern basically has two hills. So this is a great graph illustrating that, especially for annual ryegrass. So we typically recommend planting our cool season forages late September, early October, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here shortly. So, and this scenario is planted in September, and you can see after seed germination, there is a little bit of growth in that fall, early winter time period. And then as we have colder temperatures in our true winter, December, January, and February, that growth and production slows. So it doesn't die off, it doesn't go dormant, it's just not as productive, it doesn't grow as well because of cooler temperatures, especially at night. And so as we move into more of the springtime, we get greater production out of that annual ryegrass from February on into May and even possibly June. So depending on our rainfall in the spring, which a good part of our state, even in Central and East Texas, we do receive majority of our rainfall in the spring and that late winter, early spring time period. So that really promotes growth and production of ryegrass, of our annual ryegrass. So because of that bimodal growth, we do have a majority of that forage production in the springtime period. And so that is something we have to keep in mind when making our forage selections, especially with annual ryegrass and even our legumes, because they're almost more spring forage producers than they are actually winter forages. So because of that, we have a lot of they can provide a lot of competition during that spring transition period for our warm season perennials, be that Bermuda grass, Bahia grass. You know, our warm season perennials tend to break dormancy in April or May. And for a lot of cases recently in the past couple of years, they tend to break dormancy earlier. Now they may not actively start growing until May or June because that growth activity is dependent on night temperatures. So if we have ryegrass and legumes or legumes that are actively growing during that springtime, they can almost outcompete those warm season perennials. Now, we have to weigh the pros and cons of that, the pros and cons of utilizing those forages for our particular production systems. So this is one reason I do not recommend overseeding a hay meadow, because of ryegrass or legumes are such late spring forage producers. They can greatly impact that warm season perennial forage production, especially that first hay harvest that next season. So I never recommend overseeding a hay meadow, especially if we're unable to utilize that forage. So this is just to note that if you are utilizing ryegrass or legumes, that you are aware of the fact that you may need to increase your stocking rate during that spring period when you have more cool season forage production as those warm season perennials are trying to transition. So that's just an important note as far as how that forage produces, and that majority of your forage production is going to end up in the spring. So like I mentioned earlier, our planting time is typically late September, early October. With most recent years and weather patterns, even for us in Overton and East Texas, we actually have kind of delayed our planting of our cool season forages, ryegrass, legumes, or small grains to about the middle of October. We do ideally want to plant at least 6 weeks prior to our average first frost. So depending on where you are in the state, if you're further south than Overton, then your planting date was most likely be a little bit later. If you're further north, that planting date may need to be earlier. So it just depends on that average frost date. And for us, it's about November 15th. But historically, especially in the past 10 years or so, our September has been as warm or warmer and drier as August, or maybe not as dry. It just depends. It varies from year to year. So you'll have to keep that in mind, that from season to season, you may need to fluctuate as far as that planting time. Typically, when we're very hot and dry, people tend to want to wait until we have rainfall before they plant. I will tell you, with annual ryegrass seed, it's better to try to get it out before a frost, close to that 6 weeks prior to your average frost date, and wait for rainfall, as opposed to waiting until we have some good soil moisture and then planting. Because more often than not, when we are warm and dry at this time of year, a lot of folks don't plant winter pasture or don't plan on planting winter pasture. And then they call me in December or January and they've run out of hay and they want to know what they can plant. So at that point, the only thing I would recommend trying to plant would be ryegrass. But you saw that bimodal growth curve. You could just take that and shift that several months. So you're pushing your forage production further into the spring, and then you're reducing that opportunity for optimum forage production. You're not going to maximize the benefit of that annual ryegrass. So taking the risk and planting, even if we are dry, because that seed will sit there and wait for rainfall. So now that doesn't necessarily mean planting right now. For a lot of us, we probably could wait till early to mid-October before we plant. They're predicting for us to hopefully have some more moisture as we move into October and November. So hopefully that will be beneficial, but it's much better to plant and wait for rainfall than it is to wait until we've had good moisture and not plant until December or January. So like I mentioned, of our winter forages, ryegrass is the least risky. So it's the one that we can take a chance on in years where we're not so sure about the weather patterns. So when it comes to annual ryegrass, there's a lot of different varieties and it can get very overwhelming and confusing. Of course, seed availability will be a very big priority. Cost may also be a concern. But one thing that we need to pay attention to as far as ryegrass varieties is the potential production, not necessarily the yield. Part of that should be considered, but something else that should be considered is timing of that production. And so we have historically at Overton done a lot of ryegrass variety trials and have done those every year. There's some archival data that dates back well before I started working at the Overton Center. And so this is kind of a short summary of total season yield in pounds of dry matter per acre for various seasons. So that's the total season yield. Now, there's a couple of things you should keep in mind when you look at variety data. One is that most variety trials, and it's true for the Overton Research and Extension Center, that variety trials are completed in well-prepared seed beds. So that means they are planted where there's no competition. So when we are overseeding an existing stand of warm season perennial, even though that forage is not actively growing at the same time, you have competition for space. So that can greatly influence your potential yield. We also tend to fertilize these very well, especially with high rates of nitrogen. So obviously fertilization can influence your potential yield potential for any of these grasses. So that will be important to note. So the nitrogen applications can kind of serve as a gas pedal. So if you need more forage, add additional nitrogen. If you don't, you may not make as many nitrogen applications as someone else who needs additional forage. So I will point out that the last data was 2021, 2022. In 2022, 2023, with our late freezes that we very commonly had in Northeast Texas, our ryegrass variety trials, were not successful and did not yield acceptable or collectible data. I shouldn't say acceptable, I should say collectible data. So there's no data for 2022, 2023. So as you can see, ryegrass yield is fairly high across the board, well over 5,000 pounds of dry matter per acre for a total season, all the way up to close, well over 8,000 pounds of dry matter per acre for a given season. You will notice there are differences from year to year, and a lot of times that's influenced by weather patterns. So as you look at variety trial data, it is always important that you look at multiple years, look across at least 3 years, possibly even up to 5. So you can kind of find a happy medium, because weather patterns, lack of rain, rainfall, can greatly influence those yields. And they definitely do for us. These plots are not irrigated. They are highly dependent on natural rainfall. So that should give you a better idea of kind of a more realistic, especially if you look across years, as opposed to looking at a singular year. So you'll notice that there's some varieties that I've highlighted with an asterisk. Those are tetraploids. So when we talk about ryegrass varieties, there are diploids and tetraploids. So tetraploids just have twice as many chromosomes as diploids. There are a few physical characteristics and differences between tetraploids and diploids. They tend to have a wider leaf or a larger leaf compared to diploids. And some of the newer varieties, including Nelson and Tam-Tebow, they actually produce more fall forage production than a lot of our small grain forages. So that is an advantage to some of our newer varieties. So variety selection can greatly influence success and potential production and how you might use some of these different forages. So my top recommendations on ryegrass varieties would be Tam-Tebow and Nelson. And then after that, I would recommend Prime or Jumbo. Now, if you have historically been using a specific variety and it has fit your needs and your production system, then I say that's fine. Keep using what works for you. I will tell you that Gulf, as far as a variety, doesn't necessarily exist anymore. You may still see products that are labeled as Gulf, but they will likely also say VNF, which stands for variety not stated. So that's often a mixture of some different varieties. And historically, if you see a Gulf VNS, it's often a blend of different tetraploids. Um, so those variety not stated or Gulf quote unquote varieties are often cheaper, but it is potential that you're getting some higher quality or some good productive tetraploids such as Tamtivo or Nelson in those blends. But that's just something to understand as you are selecting a variety for ryegrass. So if you're interested in the Overton ryegrass variety trial data, you can locate that at the Overton website, which is overton.tamu.edu. And under the research tab is you can find annual ryegrass and legumes, or annual ryegrass and small grains and legumes options. And they will give you more information about varieties, variety trials, and different species selection, especially in the legumes. So this is an excellent resource as far as some of that information that has come out of the Overton research program. So moving on to the small grains, our other grasses. So keep in mind that small grain rye is very different than ryegrass. So when you go to a retailer to purchase seed, make sure you distinguish annual ryegrass from the small grain rye. They're very different species. Small grain rye is, of our small grains, is the most productive. It's adapted to a variety of soil types, very cold tolerant. It fits very well in a variety of different scenarios. It grows very well in East Texas or Central Texas. It will tolerate our colder winters north of I-20, much more so than, say, oats, as far as the small grain. Planting time is once again late September, early October, 6 weeks prior to your average frost date. As far as varieties, most of our variety or seed production comes out of Oklahoma and Texas. So Elbon, Maton, and Maton 2 are 3 varieties out of the Noble Research Institute. You may be familiar with them. And unfortunately, because of weather conditions last year, rye seed production was fairly low. So rye seed availability is a little bit challenging this year. If you come across a small grain rye variety, which is called Ryman, Rymin, I would not recommend it. It is probably much more readily available and it might be cheaper on a per 50-pound sack this year, but it comes out of a more northern environment. And we've actually done some evaluation of that Ryman rye at Overton, and it was just not nearly as productive as other small grain rye varieties that are available. So if you are interested in planting rye, I recommend that you locate seed as soon as possible and that you find more information about that variety if it's something you're not familiar with. If you come across the variety you want more questions about, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help you locate that information. Unfortunately, we do have some small grain variety trial data out of Overton, but it's got some age on it. When Dr. Lloyd Nelson retired, unfortunately, we have not been able to continue that small grain variety trials from year to year. So it's been several years since we've had any variety trial data out of the Overton Center. So oats are another small grain. They do very well in Central and South Texas. They're not very cold hardy. They do prefer those heavier soils, heavier clay soils, much more than, say, our very sandy soils in East Texas. They do, because they lack cold tolerance, they do very well in the fall. They tend to be fairly productive in the fall because they prefer kind of that warmer conditions as opposed to our more cold tolerant wheat or rye. So there are some varieties that do claim to be more winter hardy, but still we don't see a lot of oat production north of I-20 because of that lack of cold tolerance. So heavy grazer, Bob, Dallas, those are some varieties of oats. There should not be any challenges with locating seed of oats this year. Wheat, of our small grains, is very cold tolerant. So we do see a lot of wheat north of I-20. It is often utilized as a dual purpose crop, meaning that it's grazed initially and then harvested for grain production before grazing for a second period. So varieties of wheat, Coker, Savage, I think there's even a winter grazer wheat. So as you know, sometimes we can have variety names that are for different species. So you always need to make sure that if you're asking for winter grazer wheat, that you're getting that instead of winter grazer oats. So another small grain species is triticale. It's a cross between wheat and rye. It has excellent cold tolerance, because of the wheat component. It is a viable forage. It will grow in East Texas. We have historically had some triticale and some variety trials in the past. It's well adapted to a variety of soil types. I failed to mention that wheat prefers our heavier soils, along with oats, and rye does very well in our very sandy soils in East Texas, and actually has more tolerance of acidic soils than a lot of our other small grains. So for those of us in East Texas with sandy soils and potentially acidic soils, it works very well. Excuse me. All right, so let's see. I noticed there was a question in the chat. We'll go ahead and address that. So the question is, do you broadcast ryegrass or drill? And we will talk about establishment here after we talk about legumes. So I will gladly get to your question as we move forward. So legumes, a lot of people have interest in utilizing legumes primarily for the purpose of recycling nitrogen. So the potential to reduce or eliminate the need for inorganic nitrogen fertilizer, whether that's urea or ammonium nitrate on some of their grasses. So we'll talk about how legumes recycle, or we can potentially recycle that nitrogen from legumes. There's a lot of other advantages to utilizing legumes. Of course, utilizing any forage, ryegrass, small grains, or legumes during the winter has the potential to reduce our feeding costs and the amount of hay that we have to feed. And it can help to improve animal performance, especially in a year where hay production has been limited due to drought and high temperatures, and quality of hay is questionable, especially if you've been purchasing or had to purchase hay. And then, of course, our animals are much more efficient at harvesting those nutrients through grazing. So if we can lengthen our grazing season, that's obviously an added benefit. So, and then a lot of people have interest in utilizing legumes or winter forages for the purpose of wildlife, such as white-tailed deer, whether they're hunting or for aesthetic purposes. Excuse me. Another reason I really like and recommend utilizing some cool season annual forages, legumes, or ryegrass should be included in this as well, is when we have something that's actively growing, especially if we've overseeded into a warm season perennial sod, by having active growth, active plant growth, that can help to create competition against a lot of cool season annual weeds that might typically germinate during the winter, and even some of our early warm season weeds that start to germinate often in February and March. So that's an added benefit to help reduce some of those weed populations, and that can help reduce some of that weed competition and potentially reduce some of the herbicides or the amount of herbicides that we have to use, especially during that warm season. So it's important, if we're interested in utilizing legumes for the purpose of recycling nitrogen, is to understand how that occurs. So nitrogen is the first limiting nutrient for crop production, more often than not. And legumes have the unique ability to fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So our atmosphere is about 90% nitrogen. Even the air that we're breathing, there's quite a bit of nitrogen in it. So legumes have the ability to fix that nitrogen out of the atmosphere, use it to convert to amino acids and to protein for plant growth and production. And then that can be recycled through our livestock as they are grazing that forage, that legume that's high in crude protein. Livestock are consuming that, and then they're recycling majority of that nitrogen, 70 to 90% of those nutrients, back into the pasture through their feces and urine. Because ruminants only keep about 10 to 30% of the nutrients they ingest. So they're recycling a lot of that nitrogen back into that pasture system. So wherever they're grazing that legume, that is where they're recycling that nitrogen. So that's in a forage system where we have livestock, that's the ideal way to recycle that nitrogen, because a majority of that nitrogen is in the top portion of the plant, what we see above the soil surface. A lot of people think that that root system is just sitting there pumping nitrogen out. You do have some nitrogen released from the root structure, but a majority of the nitrogen is in that plant growth above the soil surface. So if we can take advantage of the protein and the high quality forage during the winter when we're typically feeding hay or supplementation, and then we're recycling that back through the livestock, that's several benefits in that process. So that's the ideal means of recycling that nitrogen back into that environment. So our legumes are able to fix that nitrogen because of a naturally occurring rhizobium bacteria that naturally occurs in our environment. Now, it's not, the strain can be species specific for white clover versus arrowleaf clover, what have you. So luckily, our seed companies are typically add that rhizobium bacteria to that seed and coat it. So they're protecting it from things like heat or light that seed that might be exposed to. So by planting that seed that is inoculated, that has the bacteria with it, that guarantees us success for germination and then fixation of nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So that's an important process of planting clover seed. So you need to make sure that you are planting pre-inoculated or coated seed. Coated seed means that it's been pre-inoculated and then they've added an additional coating to protect that rhizobium bacteria. If you happen to purchase uninoculated seed, then you would have to buy the inoculant, the correct rhizobium strain for that clover species. You would have to apply that directly yourself. But like I mentioned, majority of our seed retailers, seed producers, seed suppliers are coating that seed and adding that rhizobium bacteria. So they're taking that step out for you. So legumes, unfortunately, can be very sensitive to soil pH. So for us in East Texas, we're very sandy soils that tend to be acidic or have a low soil pH. That is one of our biggest hurdles as far as being successful with legumes. So we need to make sure we are using soil tests to evaluate our soil pH and applying lime accordingly. So most of our legumes prefer a soil pH of at least a 6. Our small grains and ryegrass can equally be sensitive to soil pH, so that's very important. And anytime we are introducing a new forage species into our forage system, we should always start with a soil analysis to make sure we have the appropriate soil pH and whether or not we need to add any phosphorus or potassium prior to planting to support that seed germination, root growth and development, and ultimate production. So we're going to talk about a few different clover options. We're going to focus on the Pineywoods. If you have questions about different parts of Texas, if you're located in a different county or a different part of Texas, I'll be happy to make any specific legume recommendations. But for time constraints, we're gonna stick with the Pineywoods, so East Texas. So we're going to talk about crimson clover, arrowleaf clover, ball, and white clover. And we'll also talk about hairy vetch. Rose clover, we have no seed production of rose clover, so there's no seed available for rose clover. Alfalfa is a perennial legume, and that would require a whole different discussion to talk about the potential of alfalfa in Texas. So we're going to save that for a later time. So arrowleaf clover, a cool season annual, it can be managed for reseeding. And that means that you would have to remove livestock for about 30 days in the spring to allow it to flower and to set seed. So typically I recommend, if you're using arrowleaf or crimson clover, to be prepared to replant yearly. It can be very challenging to manage for reseeding. It's not very reliable currently with the varieties that we have. And then it creates an opportunity for that clover to really outcompete those warm season perennials during that transition period. As far as varieties, you may have heard of an older variety called Uchi. Apache and Black Hawk are some varieties out of the Overton research program. Dr. Ray Smith, who is our forage legume breeder at Overton, is responsible for the release of both of those varieties. And their advantages are some disease and virus tolerance. Black Hawk has more disease and virus tolerance than Apache, and Apache has more tolerance than Uchi. You will notice the seeding rate for our different legumes will vary. That will be based on seed size. And our legumes, all of our legumes are very small seeded, so their seeding rate is fairly low, and they can be easy to establish. Arrowleaf prefers well-drained soils. As you can see, distinguishing characteristics, it does have a watermark, kind of an arrow watermark on the leaf, hence the name Arrowleaf. It does produce a white flower, so may often be confused with white or ball clover. However, it produces substantially more vertical growth compared to ball and white clover. Crimson clover, we see a lot of crimson clover in parts of Central and East Texas along the roadsides. It is planted for the purpose of beautification, produces a very pretty red or crimson flower. So it's very pretty during that springtime period. And of our legumes, our cool season legumes, it matures the earliest, or it flowers earlier than some of our other species. So for us here in Overton, East Texas, on average, it blooms or flowers about February. Now, this past year with some later freezes and different weather patterns, it was much later, but it does typically flower or have earlier spring forage production compared to some of our other legumes. It is not a reliable reseeder, but it requires some management, like I mentioned with arrowleaf clover. So I would recommend replanting from year to year if you wanted a surefire stand of crimson clover. Ball clover is well adapted to poorly drained or moderately drained soils. It doesn't produce as much vertical growth as crimson clover or arrowleaf clover. It is an excellent reseeder, even under continuous grazing. So most people would love to have ball or white clover for the sole purpose that they will reseed under continuous grazing. So those are big advantages, but you have to have the location that will support those species, because clover seed is not necessarily inexpensive. So we want to make sure we're selecting species that are adapted to our location. White clover, as far as varieties of white clover, you may be familiar with Louisiana S1, Patriot. There's a Dutch white clover. The newest variety, Natchez white clover, was released from Overton, I guess now 2 years ago. Unfortunately, there's no seed available this year. They're in the process of finding someone to produce seed and a company to sell seed. So there may not likely any Natchez white clover available this year, but you should still be able to find things like Louisiana S1 or Patriot or Dutch white clover. It's best adapted to poorly drained or bottomland sites. So we see a lot along the Trinity River bottom, Red River bottom, a lot of those true bottom locations, white clover does very well. Excuse me. Sorry about that. It is an excellent reseeder, even under continuous grazing. And as you can see for white and ball clover, their seeding rates are very low. So those seeds, excuse me. So those seeds are very small. So that's white clover. If you're in the blacklands or cross timbers, the medics, as well as hairy vetch and berseem clover are better adapted to your locations, whether it's an upland site with the medics, and then the berseem clover does better in the bottomland or poorly drained locations. And hairy vetch is well adapted to a variety of soil types. So armadillo burr medic is adapted to Central and South Texas, so it's not very cold hardy. So if you're along that I-35 corridor with some heavier soils, and south of Waco, armadillo burr medic is an excellent fit for you, and it's an excellent reseeder. If you're north of Waco, still in the Blacklands, so you're getting closer to that Fort Worth, Dallas, Stephenville area along I-35, Divine Little Burr is an excellent fit, and it also has excellent reseeding potential. Hairy vetch is well adapted to a variety of soil types, so it works well in the Blacklands and cross timbers of central and kind of that western edge of East Texas, as well as East Texas and the Pineywoods. So it's well adapted to a variety of soil types. It does not tolerate close continuous grazing, and it's not a reliable reseeder. We do see a lot of vetch along the roadsides. That's typically planted from year to year, and then it's only managed by mowing maybe once the entire season. So there's not a lot of pressure on it, but it is an excellent cover crop. But in a grazing system, it would have to be heavily managed to prevent overgrazing because it is a high risk of being overgrazed. Berseem clover definitely prefers the poorly drained or potentially flooded fields. So definitely need a very low site. It's not very drought tolerant. And it has potential for cold tolerance. So further south, as we get into South Central Texas, it's much better adapted to those locations. All right, so we're going to talk about establishment. I know there was a question about planting ryegrass, and then we'll see some other questions later. So establishment. So there's several different planting options. I like to put them in kind of a conclusive chart. So ryegrass by itself, a small grain, whether that's rye, oat, or wheat by itself. We'll plant a combination of ryegrass and a small grain, which has been a popular recommendation in the past, especially with some of our older ryegrass varieties that do not produce a lot of fall or early winter forage production. But with some of our new tetraploids, such as Nelson and Tamtibo, that's not necessarily the case. So historically, with older ryegrass varieties, we would recommend planting a small grain so that you would have some of that earlier fall forage production from that small grain and then rely on that ryegrass in the spring. But with our newer varieties of ryegrass, not only they produce some fall, early winter forage, and then also that spring forage production as well. But that still may be of interest to you to plant both, and that is an option. Ryegrass and a legume, if you're interested in recycling some nitrogen by utilizing a cool season annual legume, you could plant that in combination with ryegrass to reduce bloat potential, as well as to provide some earlier fall, early winter forage production with those tetraploid varieties. So as far as planting methods, we can always start from scratch. No, that's not the recommendation for everyone. If you are looking at, if you have a Bahia grass field that you would like to convert to Bermuda grass, or Bermuda grass field that maybe you lost part of that stand last year, or you didn't have successful establishment and you're going to have to start over next year, you can create that well-prepared seed bed by destroying all existing vegetation with an application of Roundup at 5 to 6 quarts per acre. Create your prepared seed bed, and then instead of letting that land lay fallow all winter, you could come in and plant a cool season annual forage, be that ryegrass or small grain or a combination of ryegrass and a legume, whatever you decide. And then in the spring, kill all existing vegetation, whatever you weren't able to utilize during that time period. And then you're ready to plant your warm season perennial, be it by seed or by sprigs. Creating that prepared seed bed, you could plant a lot earlier because you don't have any competition. You can drill or broadcast that seed depending on what you're planting, and we'll talk about that as we go into some of our other planting methods. But you have a lot of flexibility, but it's a great way if you're going to be planting a new field to start that process now and greatly reduce that weed competition during that establishment year for that warm season perennial. So most of us, because of space and we already have an established warm season perennial, a lot of us are going to be overseeding into an existing side. So there's a couple of different ways we can plant into an existing side. So we can plant into a disturbed sod. So that means that we have come in and done a light disking, no more than 2 inches deep. And that disking helps, especially for things like Bermuda grass that produce a very dense sod. It helps to open up that sod. It'll actually slow the growth of that warm season perennial. It kind of, slow its growth. And then it helps to increase seed to soil contact. So it really reduces that warm season perennial growth, increases seed to soil contact, and it can help improve or promote the germination and the success of that cool season annual forage that you're planting. After a light disking, you can come back in and drill that seed in. If you have a drill, you can broadcast that seed depending on seed size and recommendations. Following whether you're using a drill or a broadcast, you can come back in with a drag. You may notice in that upper left-hand corner behind that drill, they've actually added a drag. He's dragging a drag behind the drill, so he's doing both at the same time. Or if you're going to continue to graze that Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, you can allow your cattle, their hoof action as they graze will kind of serve as a drag and knock any excess seed that gets stuck in the thatch down and increase that seed to soil contact. So you don't have to drag if you're going to continue to graze that pasture. So Dr. Lloyd Nelson and Dr. Gerald Evers several years ago did some research on annual ryegrass and how planting method influenced potential yield, especially or on ryegrass. And so they harvested that ryegrass. So they looked at seeding rate and then planting method. So as we look at our graph, our seeding rate is on the x-axis, going from 15 pounds per acre up to 45 pounds per acre. The yield is on the y-axis. And the different color of bars, the red bar is a light disking, then seed was broadcast and then dragged. The blue bar is a light disking, and then the seed was drilled. The yellow bar is no seed, no sod disturbance. It was just, the seed was just drilled into the sod with no light disking. And then the green bar, the seed was broadcast and then dragged with no disking. So the takeaway message here is that light disking greatly impacted the potential yield or the forage production of that ryegrass. So that process helped to reduce that competition from that warm season perennial and gave that annual ryegrass kind of a jump start or a leading edge against those warm season perennials. So that can be an advantage. Now, I know a lot of folks are limited by equipment as far as how they might establish. So just know that your planting method could potentially influence your production, but some ryegrass is better than none, or having to rely solely on hay that may be questionable. So yield may not be as critical to you. So it'll just depend on your particular forage system. If you're planting into an undisturbed sod, there's a couple of recommendations. One, you absolutely need to make sure that your sod is short, that you have either grazed it down or potentially cut it if you've had some excess forage growth, which for a lot of folks this year, that may not be that big of an issue. Most of us already have a short sod because of drought and heat. And then I would also recommend delaying your planting date. So maybe instead of mid-October, maybe you plant a few weeks, towards late October. Now you still need to pay attention to weather patterns and when that potential first frost might be, but delaying, waiting until we have some cooler temperatures can help slow that warm season perennial growth and decrease that competition. You can also drill or broadcast, into an undisturbed sod. Now this is solely recommended for anything that is small seeded. So that is annual ryegrass or our small seeded legumes. So you could achieve this with arrowleaf, crimson clover, white, ball clover. Hairy vetch would probably be questionable. It's a little bit larger seeded, but this is the easiest way, requires the least amount of equipment to plant something like annual ryegrass or our small seeded legumes. I do not recommend broadcasting into an undisturbed sod with a small grain. So if you're going to broadcast a small grain instead of using a drill, you absolutely have to do a light disking before and after broadcasting that seed, because those small grains have to be planted at least an inch deep, whereas ryegrass and our legumes don't need to be planted much deeper than about a quarter to half an inch, no deeper than half an inch. So they can be planted very shallow. And that can be achieved with broadcasting into an undisturbed sod and then dragging or using hoof action to help, kind of push that seed out of that thatch. So if you're going to broadcast a small grain, you have to lightly disc before and after broadcasting. So that is critical. I've had a lot of folks that have tried to broadcast a small grain, even with a single disking, and they were unsuccessful. So if you're going to invest the dollars in the seed, you would like to be successful. So make sure you are following, the best recommendations as far as planting to be successful. Fertilization will also be important for any of our cool season forages. Whether it's a grass or a legume, phosphorus and potassium will be important. So I do recommend a soil analysis to determine how much you have carried over from that season or maybe from a previous season and what might be needed for those cool season forages. Soil pH is very critical, especially for our legumes. Ryegrass may also be sensitive to soil pH. Now, based on the amount of volunteer ryegrass we see in East Texas, it is most likely more tolerant to lower soil pH than we probably think. However, you still want to make sure that it is close to 6, 5.5, 5.8, close to 6. I don't know how successful you would be if your soil pH was 4 or lower even with ryegrass. Of our small grain rye is the most tolerant of acidic soils, and that's based on some research by Dr. Smith at Overton. So wheat and oats would definitely prefer a higher soil pH, but they're better adapted to those heavier soils that do tend to be a little bit higher in soil pH. Now, nitrogen should not be applied until our warm season perennials have gone dormant. Now, if you're planting into a well-prepared seed bed, once those seeds have germinated and started growing, you can apply nitrogen. And that could likely be earlier than someone who's overseeding into a perennial sod. So once that warm season perennial has gone dormant, which is typically after a first frost, then you could apply nitrogen. So we want to make sure that nitrogen goes to that cool season forage. If you applied it at planting, say if you threw out some ryegrass seed tomorrow and you put out nitrogen and we got some rainfall, that warm season perennial is going to use that nitrogen and that won't be there for that cool season forage. So keep in mind in regards to that timing of those applications. For our legumes, make sure you're selecting a species that's adapted to your location, that you are buying coated or pre-inoculated seed, which most of our seed retailers do sell. That's most likely what's going to be available at this point compared to previous years. Since they are small seeded, they can be broadcast or drilled. There are drills that come with a small seed box specific for legumes. So it may depend on the equipment you have available or access to as to which means of establishment, but that light disking will help to increase seed to soil contact. But you can broadcast legume seed into an undisturbed sod. So if you have the bare bones of equipment, that may be the best way or the only way for you to potentially establish those legumes. So if anyone is working with NRCS with one of their cost sharing programs, especially if they have with Equip, they have at times funded a program or programs to introduce or establish legumes into a forage system for the purpose of recycling nitrogen, improving soil tilth, wildlife habitat, what have you. So if you are working with NRCS and their cost sharing programs, you have to follow their recommendations and their guidelines. Their planting recommendations are based on PLS or pure live seed. So on a seed tag, it will give you a percentage of pure live seed that they have tested for that particular bag of seed. So that may be 80% or 90%. So obviously, if it's less than 100%, you have to adjust your seeding rate. You'd have to increase your seeding rate by that percentage. So if you are planting for Equip, you already have to adjust your seeding rate for pure live seed. I would not recommend planting coated seed because that coating adds additional weight. So for the same weight, you get fewer seeds. So you would have to increase your seeding rate for pure live seed and then increase it for the coating. So that may not necessarily be very economical. But nowadays it may be difficult to find uninoculated or uncoated seed. So it may depend on what is available to you, as well as what are the equip recommendations. But keep that in mind. That could become pretty expensive to try to do both. So you may want to look at all of your options and the cost associated with those. For a legume, if you're planting a legume by itself, so if you have decided to overseed your Bermuda grass pasture with crimson clover, you're not going to plant any grasses, you do not need to apply nitrogen because we want that legume to fix the free nitrogen out of the atmosphere. If you apply nitrogen to a pure stand of a legume, it's going to use that nitrogen you applied versus the free stuff in the atmosphere. Now, if you plant a legume with a combination with ryegrass, you will need some nitrogen for that grass, especially in the fall, early winter period. But after the first of the year, the following year, we want our legume to start fixing the nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So we don't recommend any additional nitrogen applications basically beyond Christmas. That legume will fix the nitrogen and it will provide enough for that grass, that ryegrass, that you won't need any additional nitrogen applications. And now another aspect of utilizing legumes, and even ryegrass and small grains, are the herbicides that we have used. So specifically for legumes first, all the products under legume program and non-legume program. So all the herbicides on this table or on this slide will kill actively growing legumes. The difference between legume program and non-legume program, the products under legume program, 2,4-D, Weedmaster, which is 2,4-D, and dicamba, do not have a very long soil residual. So if they are utilized during the summer, they will not prevent seed germination of that legume in the fall. Now, I do recommend picking the date or time you think you might plant your legume. Say you could select October 1st. Count 6 weeks back, and that should be the last time you even apply 2,4-D or Weedmaster. So the products under non-legume program, unfortunately, if we apply them at high rates or at multiple times or later in the season especially, because of their soil residual, they can prevent legume seeds from germinating in the fall because they're not going to be able to differentiate a goat weed seed from a clover seed. So they can prevent that germination. Now, Resilon, a new product by InView, I need to change that, apologies. Bayer is now InView. Resilon has if I remember, it is a 12-month restriction on planting an annual grass. So that would include ryegrass or small grain. Has a 24-month restriction on planting a broadleaf crop, such as a legume. And then it has an eight-month restriction to plant a perennial grass by seed or by sprigs. So a lot of people have been utilizing Resilon for crabgrass control or sandbur control in their warm season perennials. So if you have, make sure you know when the last time you used that product. So you're not planting seed into an environment where it's not going to germinate or be successful. So that this is important information to know. So it may be critical to plant your cool season forages in a pasture where you have very easy or minimal weed issues versus an area that's taken over with woody species or sandburs per se. So keep that in mind as you are selecting where you're going to plant your winter forages and which winter forages you might decide to plant. Metsulfuron methyl that's found in Cimarron Plus, Chaparral, does have activity on ryegrass. So it's a herbicide that can kill actively growing ryegrass. So you'll need to pay attention to timing of those applications as well. So a few things just to keep in mind as you think about what herbicides you've used recently or in the past 12 months. When did you use them at what rates, and how might that impact your establishment of your cool season forages this year? One last thing to discuss is the impact of our cool season annuals on our warm season perennials. Since we are overseeding often our cool seasons into our warm seasons, we need to understand how that impacts the forage production of that warm season perennial. And I have seen in years where utilizing cool season forages has had a great impact on our warm season forages, in addition to things like drought or lack of fertilizer, disease. So understand that loss of stands of our warm season perennials is often a cumulative effect. It's because of a combination of things, maybe not a singular thing. So our cool season forages and our sod preparation in the fall can impact our Bermuda grass production that following spring, especially that first harvest. And so Dr. Evers did some evaluation over 3 years at Overton, so in a sandy soil, and he looked at different clover or ryegrass that was overseeded into existing sods that were disked or sods that were not, and different sod heights. So all of those treatments greatly influenced or did influence the Bermuda grass forage production. The stubble height and then disking had a bigger impact, much more so than what was overseeded. So whether it was clover or ryegrass, I think the impact was about 250 pounds of dry matter per acre was the reduction in that first yield, whereas stubble height and disking reduced forage yield by about 500 pounds of dry matter per acre for that first harvest. So that's just the first harvest. So he did note that in the locations where they did not overseed with crimson, with clover or ryegrass, that they did have a lot of weed pressure. So that shows you the added benefit of those cool season forages. Now, in a pasture system, taking that hit to our Bermuda grass is not going to be as critical as it would be in a hay meadow. So this is just FYI. This is another reason, or this is reiterating why I do not recommend overseeding a hay meadow, because for a lot of us, our hay meadow is our prize. We have a prize hay meadow. It's very productive. We've spent a lot of time controlling weeds. We really focus our fertilization program. So we want to maximize production or optimize production, and overseeding with a cool season forage is greatly going to influence that warm season perennial, that first harvest. So that is important information to know. In a grazing situation, it's not as critical. If we're looking at the benefit of having a cool season forage to graze versus feeding hay that might be of questionable source or low nutritive value, and also costly, especially this year with drought conditions, hay prices are substantially higher and availability is limited. So winter forages are a great means to reduce those feeding costs and those hay costs. So there's, as with everything in agriculture, there are pros and cons. Do you just have to look at what's critical for your production system, for your forage production system? So with that, I will answer some questions.